knife blade up on the top.
Are all of these incredible objects recovered from, in general, recovered from tomb burial sites?
That's an excellent question. We made an attempt, the team of curators for this exhibition tried as hard as we could to pick as many objects as we could that actually came from archaeological excavations. This one happens to come from one of those. That came from contexts that have been excavated by scientists rather than by looters.
Right.
Now, there were a number of objects that were excavated by looters, but we tried to have the largest number of objects that we could that came from known contexts. And those are nicely documented in the catalog.
So the majority of these have fairly solid provenance.
Exactly. Yes, the majority of them do. Not all,
No,
but many of them do.
Oh my gosh.
But you get a sense of how spectacular this exhibition was. These are flagons that were used for drinking maize beer. They're about that big.
Oh my goodness.
And were made out of solid hammered gold.
Oh my goodness.
Some were decorated to be shown standing up. Some were decorated to be shown upside down. This is a wonderful example of a guy who's, you don't see his face, but he's actually holding a little spondylus shell. He's holding a little spiny oyster between his hands. So again, you see the recurrence of that shell even in the gold work. This is a gold mask that would have covered a mummy bundle on the north coast of Peru. And this is a highly decorated sacrificial knife. It's actually probably not used in sacrifices itself, but represents the kind of knives that would have been used by that decapitator god. And this figure is kind of shown wearing a very elaborate headdress decorated with this blue stone. And he also has ear flares, very similar to the one I was just showing you, ear ornaments. Some of the finest craftsmanship ever done in the ancient Americas. Some other examples of these shells, decorated spondylus shells, spiny oyster shells that have been smoothed and polished and worked with inlay to represent a seated individual, probably a representation of a king, also wearing his fancy ear ornaments. And over here, representations of birds that are eating fish inlaid on the shell. This is a feather tunic. You can actually see that's where the head would go. This is a poncho made out of cloth that is, all of the colors that you see here are bird feathers that have come from macaws or from other colored tropical birds, where they remove the individual feather and then tie that individual feather to a piece of cotton and then weave those into the fabric. So a person is literally wearing feathers.
I would have thought an object like that old, made of feather, would deteriorate. Why are these not deteriorating?
That's an excellent question, because we're talking about South America. And most of us think about South America as the tropics. And the birds that you see here are tropical birds that would have come from the Amazonian forest. But the reason why we still have this is that the coast of Peru is one of the driest parts of the world. Dry deserts. Environments very similar to that of Egypt, where you also get very good preservation of things that are organic.
Amazing.
And the reason why these tropical bird feathers have survived is that they were taken from Amazonia to the coast of Peru, where they were then worked onto these objects that were preserved in the context of dry deserts.
Amazing.
Other examples of cloth include this costume of what would have been a Wari king of southern Peru. This is his tunic, which was actually woven in two different sections that were then sewn together. And this is a woven hat. And any of you who are into weaving know how difficult it is to add colors to whatever it is that you're doing. Count the number of colors in this hat. It actually has about 8 different colors, all of which represent organic dyes. And then this is probably the most spectacular textile in the entire exhibition. It's the only one of its kind that has survived in the world. It's a type of cloth that was called kumbi, that was made by special, they were called virgins of the sun, women weavers who worked exclusively for the Inca emperor. And this would have been a tunic worn by an Inca emperor, probably the emperor who was ruling at the time of the arrival of the Spanish, perhaps Huascar. But do you see what the design is that's on here? I've already told you about one of these patterns. See the checkerboard,
Oh, yeah.
the warrior's
Oh,
tunic?
yeah.
This is actually representing all of the different tunics of the different military regiments. So in fact, it's the king representing himself wearing the emblems of all of these different regional ethnic warrior groups that were underneath his power. And this is a close-up on the right, but this is what the tunic looked like as a whole. Here's the slit for his neck, so you can sort of see the sense of how he would have worn it. And made out of extremely finely woven fabric. Well, the area that I was responsible for, which of course I'm running out of time on, was Central America, Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia. And among the objects that were featured from this part of the world included this beautiful jadeite clamshell, about 30 centimeters wide, with a decoration on it of a hand holding a baby jaguar that has been carved onto the shell. So we actually get a combination of that shell and jadeite in the same object, showing how those two different materials were valued. It's actually in a style that comes from central Mexico, but it was found in an excavated provenience context in central Costa Rica. Other objects of jadeite include these bird pectorals that would have been hung around the neck, representing, actually some represent birds, the older ones represent birds, so you can see the bird's beak and eyes. Some of them represent humans, standing people, but each with an axe blade. In fact, that's a symbol of power, is to have the blade of an axe, what we might refer to as a tomahawk, or a carved stone blade, that would be representing the power, the violent power of a chief or of a king. The ability to work jadeite was incredible, with drilling and creating spaces within things. This would have been probably a scepter or a staff held by an ancient Costa Rican chief. And there's that little bat figure again. Among some of the most spectacular objects were extremely rare. There are actually only a handful of these that are known. Helmets made out of hammered gold. This one decorated with crocodiles to show the power of the crocodile in the chief. There are actually 4 crocodiles on the 4 sides of this. And then this object, which was found in an excavated burial at a site called Sitio Conte in central Panama, that dates to about 800 AD, roughly the same time as the ancient Mayas, but a completely different culture called the Cocle. This was probably laid on top of fabric. It actually has small perforations around the outside of it, because having metal next to your head in the hot tropical sun is probably not the most comfortable thing. So they would put a cotton fabric inside of it. The design itself is hammered into the outside of the object. It's a bit difficult to see from this photograph, but I have a drawing that will help you to get a sense of what the design is. This is the top of the crown, and this is the design that's been hammered into it. A double-headed crocodilian figure with his arms and legs out on either side, and he has claws, not fingers. So representing this transformation of a powerful individual into a menacing creature, but all out of beautiful hammered gold. This is a chest ornament, also from central Panama. And this, a little bit out of focus, is a representation of 2 standing figures, one facing each direction. And then these are 2 other pectorals. I mentioned that this one has a sort of a strange creature, probably a crocodilian creature, but also with bird legs to it, so kind of a magical, visionary creature. We don't know specifically what it represents. And then one of these faces, and again, I said when you're wearing a nose ornament, people can't tell that you have fangs. Another way of representing those fangs is just simply to show them. We have representations of human faces with very prominent canines, also from central Panama. And then ornaments, including ones with little fly, insect with rock crystal as the abdomen, a small crocodilian creature with this big uncut green emerald as its abdomen, and then this little jaguar-like creature carved out of the bone, of the, actually carved out of the vertebra of a sperm whale.
Were most of these objects recovered in the 19th century?
Actually, these objects were recovered in the 1930s by an archaeologist named Samuel Lothrop, excavating at Sitio Ponte.
Just a curiosity, I know you can't answer, but any speculation about how much of this stuff remains undiscovered?
Yes. There's a site called El Caño, which is also located in Panama, just not very far from Sitio Ponte where this was excavated. And my colleagues, Julio Mayo and her brother Carlos, are in charge of the excavation there. We were not able to get any of the objects from their excavation in this exhibition because they would not let them leave Panama until they had been exhibited in Panama. But they began excavating there about 6 years ago. And they are finding objects as spectacular or more spectacular than this.
Good gracious.
But they're going very, very slowly. And they have estimated that it may take a century to do the entire excavation.
Is that true of the whole area we're talking about, that there are still sites to be?
Well, there may be. These sites are very, very rare. And El Caño was just discovered, as I said, well, the site itself was discovered decades ago, but they only discovered that it still had intact burials about 6 or 7 years ago.
How can they keep it safe?
Well, that's a very good question. This is Panama. We're talking about countries that don't necessarily have the resources to be able to protect those.
Right.
It's a very difficult situation. They do have the support of the government. They do have local police. But it's very difficult in a poor country to tell people, well, there's gold over there, there's a gold treasure over there, but please don't go dig it up. In fact, in Peru, you often find that the professional looters will say, our ancestors knew that we were going to be poor, and they put these treasures in the ground
For us.
For us. That becomes a justification for excavating. Fortunately, these weren't dug by treasure hunters. These were dug by archaeologists. All of these objects that I just showed you.
The ones that are dug by treasure hunters, do they go into some kind of black market thing, or do they get acquired by museums?
Both.
Both.
They go into the black market, and unscrupulous museums acquire them from the black market. In fact, antiquities trade is a very serious problem in the country right now, in all of these countries right now. Typically, stolen antiquities travel along with and in the same channels as cocaine and weapons, and are often being exchanged by the same people. And one of the reasons why these antiquities are so valuable in that context is that they represent a very high dollar exchange value, but they're not traceable. So in fact, purchasing antiquities is a form of money laundering. And transporting antiquities becomes a way of transporting significant financial resources. But unfortunately, museums will buy these objects. Yes?
I'm really curious. All these archaeology sites, have they discovered any written documents? And is that another whole lecture?
That's an excellent question. That's a really excellent question. The answer is the only written documents that we have come from cultures in Mexico, where we have books that were written on deerskin. And I actually have some pictures of those, that we have some of those in the exhibition. South of Mexico, you do not get the preservation of these. In fact, the Mayas had 5 of these books, one of which has just recently been authenticated. But in Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and South, they didn't have any. However, in Peru, they had a system of recording information on knotted cords. And there's a project at Harvard that has been successful in showing that many of these knotted cords actually encode a language. And you can read words and syllables in these knotted cords. And they are working bit by bit to see if they can reconstruct what the sounds were. But it's a form of 3-dimensional writing done in textiles.
Wow.
which is really fascinating. Unfortunately, they have not yet gotten a complete decipherments of texts there.
Writing did occur on stone.
But writing occurred on stone, writing occurred on pottery, writing occurred on jadeite and other objects for the Mayas and for the Mixtecs and for the Aztecs. Those are the groups that had writing. And for those groups, especially for the Maya, we can read about 90% of what they wrote now.
Wow.
So a lot of that.
It's amazing.
Well, I've been going a little bit slower than I thought I would, but I want to show you some other objects that are particularly fascinating. This is one that I quote unquote discovered in one of the museums that we visited. It was an object that had been unknown, I mean not unknown, it had been published in the 1960s and then pretty much forgotten about. And it wasn't until we pulled the drawer out and I looked at it and I said, oh my God, that's what that is. Because people had forgotten where it was. People had wanted to feature it in exhibitions, but nobody knew where to find it. Mostly because the photographs of it were so crappy and nobody could make it out in the photographs. But we looked at it and found it. And what it is a slate disc that was excavated in Costa Rica in the 1960s. And I'll show you a few bits of it. You were asking about writing. We don't have writing per se, but we have enough that we can kind of figure out what they were trying to communicate. See these footprints? Each of these is a foot with toes. This shows the inside part of the foot. That's the outside part of the foot. So these are actually footprints that go that direction on the top and this direction on the bottom. They actually indicate travel. Why is the travel taking place? Well, in this bottom register, what we have a representation of is a diver going down to shell beds to collect these spondylus shells. They represented the sea coast by these wave-like things. The scalloping shows that that's the coast, and this is what's underneath the water. So he's diving underneath the water to collect the shells. And then on the other side is someone who is actually has the Mexican equivalent of a speech balloon, which is this big scroll coming out of his mouth, which actually has little shells on it. So he's actually talking about shells. And in the upper register, we have two guys who are seated. Actually, they're upside down. One person sitting here and one person sitting there, and they're sitting surrounded by these shells. And so what this object shows is a shell diver and then travel to make transactions to obtain these shells. All done on a object made out of slate that on the back of it had pyrite plaques attached in order to make a mirror.
No.
So really spectacular object. These are some details of it, but that's another example of the shell, and here you can see the shell beds. So shell was a super important object, super important material for these cultures. And actually here we can see some other examples of shell divers who are collecting these shells, and a close-up of the shell divers. One of the other objects featured in the exhibition that sort of ties things together is this little guy made out of pottery, who actually is wearing a number of these objects. He's wearing gold discs. He's wearing what are probably gold ear flares. He's also wearing decorations that probably represent a small jade axe around his neck. This is actually a portrait of an ancient Costa Rican chief, kneeling and dressed completely in all of his finery. But he's also decorated with heads of crocodiles, and this kind of jagged decoration that you see up along the top of his head indicates that he himself is a crocodile man, that he has the aspects of a crocodile, and that's what the jewelry imparts to him, is this magical crocodile sense. Some other wonderful pairings that we had of objects included stone sculptures from Costa Rica, including this individual who's actually holding a trophy head in one hand and an axe in the other. He's actually cut off somebody's head, but he's wearing around his neck an object that we found among the jewelry, the actual type of jewel that he was wearing, which is a collection of these small creatures kind of strung together in order to make the ornament that he's wearing around his neck. So these objects were worn by people who were men, actors, decapitators, warriors. It provides us a context for understanding this jewelry. There are also beautiful gold, sorry about this, beautiful gold bird pendants, very famous from Costa Rica and Panama. And here you can get a sense of the amount of detail that went into this. These objects were made by a technique called lost wax casting, where the object was first made in wax and then covered in clay. When the clay dries, it leaves a hollow inside. You heat it up and pour the wax out, and then when you put liquid gold into the mold, it takes the exact shape of the wax model, which allows you to make incredible details, such as the eyes and the nose and the deer antlers that show this person transforming into a deer, probably a representation of a shaman. What's unusual is the sort of bisexual nature of this individual. Some have interpreted breasts indicating that it's female, but he also has male genitalia. So one of the characteristics of shamanic transformation may have been the ability to be typically bi-gender or gender ambiguous. And how much longer can I go?
Well, we're at closing time,
Okay.
1 o'clock.
Let me just show a few more things and then,
Okay.
and then I'll finish it. Just to give you a quick run through. I didn't get a chance to talk about all the things I wanted to. But here's another example of one of the little shamans in gold done with the lost wax casting. This is a burial assemblage from what was probably a burial mummy who was decorated with a mask made out of hammered gold with silver bangles for the eyes. This is a chest ornament made out of hammered gold, representing a face with 2 large ear ornaments coming from southern Colombia. These objects come from Colombia. Beautiful bangles. They really went for the bling, things that would shine when you dance. This is an object that would have been worn on the chest. This is an object, if you look closely, it also has that thing that goes in the nasal septum. That's a nose ornament. That's a nose ornament, with each of these individually attached bangles attached with a wire, and then all of these little objects hanging down. Just the amount of craftsmanship that went into that was really pretty spectacular, but it's topped by this object, which actually has lots of different moving parts to it, but it's also a nose ornament.
Oh my God.
This would have been worn on somebody's face. It's about that big. And it's all made out of very, very thin, almost foil-like gold. So it's not all that heavy, although gold does tend to be heavy.
Good grief.
But the extra flashiness is by these objects that move back and forth that have been attached there by wires. The whole thing is articulated, so it moves back and forth. So you get the maximum amount of flash if you're standing there in the sunlight or the firelight as you're wearing it.
They must have had really good doctors in those days.